Hello, and welcome to Brass Tacks Talking Cybersecurity, brought to you by Fortinet. I'm your host, Joe Robertson, and cybersecurity is exactly what this show is about. But it's not all about technology. We talk about the business implications of cybersecurity for decision makers, executives, and board members whose roles could be impacted by cyber attacks, which, when you get down to it, really means just about anybody. As for me, I'm an executive consultant helping top managers navigate the intersection between business needs and security requirements. We call this program Brass Tacks because the expression getting down to brass tacks means getting to the core of a subject, the important points. So let's get down to brass tacks. Today's guest is Mark Child, Associate Research Director of European Security at the market research organization IDC. Mark, welcome to Brass Tacks. Let's talk cybersecurity.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here.
Now, you're an analyst at IDC, and as such, you're dealing with executives, et cetera. I don't think that talking cybersecurity is really a subject that executives are going to think is irrelevant to them. I don't think anyone argues with the fact that it has huge business implications these days. But it's an area where the critical attacks that are going on involve lots of different risks. Are you seeing that boards of directors are really paying the appropriate amount of attention to that risk as they should be?
Well, it's certainly improved in recent years, and one of the big forces that's been driving that is regulation. The EU really sees legislation as a means to drive the overall cybersecurity posture through companies across ecosystems, across countries and the region as a whole. So in October this year, the NIS2 directive comes into force in all EU member states. This is the EU's most far-reaching piece of cybersecurity legislation. It will affect more verticals than the previous iteration of NIS. It will affect companies even down into the mid-market. And perhaps most importantly, it will mean that senior management is now going to be held responsible for overseeing the implementation of the designated cybersecurity risk management measures, and they will be held liable if there are infringements. So this really does mean that senior management needs to sit up and take notice of cybersecurity.
Being liable certainly can have a way of focusing the attention. There's no doubt about that. And NIS2, of course, is European Union. There are similar packages of regulations around the world. There's the NIST with a T. That happens to be second iteration of that in the United States. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is looking at boards of directors and executives as being personally liable as well. There's a lot of these, and there's specific sectors that have different types of regulation, like DORA for finance in the EU, and there's a whole bunch of them like this. So it's something that a board of directors has to be paying attention to. Now, one of the things about cybersecurity, though, that I think is different from past types of risks that boards of directors deal with is the fact that it's relatively new. It's really technical and it's really frightening. So how should boards and executives be thinking about it?
Right, you're absolutely right. Boards now have to pay attention to cybersecurity risk, but they don't really understand it. So when we're talking to CISOs who need to go in front of the board and present what the organization needs, they need to frame those discussions in a language that the board understands. So we will typically talk about four types of business risk. So first of all, you've got the operational risk. What is the cost going to be to your organization if systems are down for 48 hours or 72 hours or a week? You're not going to be able to engage with your customers. You're not going to be able to take orders. You're not going to be able to bill your suppliers and your partners. And there are real world examples of the cost this can generate. There was a Scandinavian aluminium producer that was hit by a ransomware attack, and its systems were offline for almost a week, and it cost them in the region of $50 million. One of the most high-profile ones was Maersk, the shipping giant, who got hit by the NotPetya attack. Now, their systems were offline for almost 2 weeks, and it cost in the region of 300 million. And they weren't the only 9-figure victim of NotPetya.
And that was several years ago, that hit a lot of companies, but that was one of the more prominent ones.
That was, yeah. So that's operational risk. Then you've got reputational risk. What is the impact that a cyber attack is going to have on the stock price, on the reputation? Are you going to lose customers basis of this? So a very prominent example there was the UK telco TalkTalk. They were hit 3 times within the space of a year. Now, their business recovered quite quickly after the first 2 attacks, but after the third attack, which saw the leak of more than 150,000 customers' personal data, the fallout was a lot bigger, with a hefty fine levied by the regulator. And I read an in-depth analysis by a brand sentiment consultancy that said they were still suffering significant negative impacts to their brand and reputation a year after that third attack.
Yeah, those are examples that I've read a number of different articles in the press, in the specialized press. They're not the only companies that get hit like this, but those were very prominent. Are there other types of risks that would be important for the board to be looking at?
Yeah, for sure. Compliance risk. So there was a global hotel chain that acquired another hotel chain. And what they weren't aware of was that the systems of that company they were acquiring had already been compromised and contained malware. When they connected their systems, the hackers were able to steal almost 500 million customers' data. Initially, the company was threatened with a £100 million fine from the regulator. In the event, I think the final figure was 18.4 million, but that's still no small amount. And on top of that, I believe there were several class action lawsuits brought against that company. So the compliance risk is a big one. And last, but by no means least, is the strategic risk. Now, what happens when your company's intellectual property, your plans, your secrets are leaked? You lose competitive advantage. Potentially, competitors will come in and steal your customers. So one very dark example of this was the Canadian network and telecommunications equipment manufacturer Nortel. So it turned out that several of their senior management had account credentials compromised, and over a number of years, unknown to them, the hackers were exfiltrating technical papers, R&D reports, business plans.
Those are the crown jewels of the company.
They are the crown jewels, and Nortel no longer exists. So that's how devastating an impact it can have. The last one I want to mention, there was a French defense contractor that produces submarines. They suffered an attack, and thousands of pages of documentation on one of their military submarines were stolen. A model of submarine that they'd already delivered to multiple countries around the world. Now, what made this particularly fraught for them was they were in the process of bidding for a multi-billion-dollar contract to supply the Australian military with submarines. In the end, thankfully, they did win that contract. The model of submarine that was being discussed was a different model, so it wasn't considered a significant risk. But that would have been a very worrying time for the board and the senior management.
For these sorts of risks and general cybersecurity risks overall, a board is going to be looking to its cybersecurity team. And in the last few years, last decades or so, the concept of a chief information security officer has come to the fore. In many cases, it reports at high levels. I interact with a lot of companies, you do too. What I've seen is that in many cases, the board of directors has direct reporting from the CISO, whether it's a direct reporting line or regular reports to the board. But in many cases, especially smaller companies, the CISO is actually in a lower part of the organization reporting into the CIO or the chief financial officer or the chief risk officer. Are you seeing that as well, or have things been changing with the prominence of these new regulations?
Yeah, I would say compared to a few years ago, the situation has definitely improved. You know, it used to be the CISO and his security team sat in the basement given the remit of just stop all the threats, right?
Right, update the antivirus. And
exactly. Silver lining, but one of the triggers for the change was the COVID pandemic, because almost overnight, organizations had to shift from being bricks and mortar and physical engagement with your partners and your customers. Everything had to go digital. And that brought with it considerable risk. Now, all of a sudden, the CISO was brought up from the basement and he was center stage because business was asking him, we need to do this. Can you ensure that we can do it securely? And the CISO gained a lot of reputational capital during this time. The security department became seen as business enablers. It's important that that reputational capital isn't squandered, but nevertheless, it was a significant improvement. So IDC, we run surveys throughout the region. Last year, we did an EMEA-wide CISO survey. And what we found was 1 in 5 CISOs is reporting directly to the CEO, which is a fair result. A further 30% will report either to the head of IT security or the chief IT security officer, and around a quarter will report to the chief risk officer. So they might not all be direct to C-level, but they're at least C-1, which is an improvement from what it was before. And maybe one last stat to run by you. We also ask how, to what extent is security involved in all the new projects and initiatives that your company's rolling out? And almost half of organizations say security is in there from the beginning, in the design and planning phase. And security has to be baked in. This is the best way to do it. It's also the most cost-effective way to do it.
Yes, getting something in from the start is a lot better than trying to bolt it on at the end, especially when it comes to security. Exactly. So if the CISOs are now reporting into the board in some way, shape, or form, at least with physical and documentary reports, what types of tools do they have to actually provide real information and data that the board of directors can act on to decide what their appetite for risk is and what they're willing to pay for and what they're going to put off?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we're talking about is essentially the challenge of cyber risk quantification. So historically, organizations haven't been very good at doing this. A lot of it was very manual. A lot of it is very subjective, what number you put on each item in your list. And from companies that I've spoken to, it's a very labor-intensive process. They get one round of risk assessments done, and the next round is already upon them because it takes them so long to do it. What we've seen, particularly with all of these regulations coming out, is there's a lot of demand for modern cyber risk quantification dashboards. These look at contextualizing the risks. What are the vulnerabilities in my key assets that hackers might target? They look at providing a comprehensive scope. So think about it. Your modern organization has assets on premises, in public cloud, maybe in private cloud. You've got OT and IoT in your environment, and risk assessments need to look at that holistic whole. At the same time, as you look at all of that, there needs to be filtering and prioritization, because you can't shower your security team with an enormous list of risks that need addressing now. They need to understand.
So that sounds like it's going to be very important to have at least machine learning and artificial intelligence and tools to be able to do that, because there are, in many cases, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of entries in those logs. No human being can do it manually.
Exactly. So that's the way the market's going. These solutions have matured a lot. IDC also, like everyone else, we publish our predictions every year, and we believe that in the next couple of years, particularly led by the large mature companies, so think those in the European Fortune 500 and so on, will be adopting these holistic, proactive, and often AI or ML driven risk quantification tools to help guide their security strategy and investments.
So what are the kinds of metrics that a board of directors is going to be looking to get from those tools? How are they going to evaluate something that is so technically complicated?
That's a big question.
That's why we've got you here.
There are a lot of metrics out there, but maybe before we get into the metrics, let's just think a little bit about the process. Now, before you go down that road, first of all, the CISO and perhaps the chief risk officer, maybe the data protection officer, maybe the CIO need to identify what are the organization's critical assets, which systems and applications do they need to protect, and what are the risks. They then need to present those risks to the board, because it's the board's job to define the risk appetite of the organization for each of those risks. So ultimately, the board owns the risk, but the CISO is tasked with managing the risk. Once you've got that, then you can talk about metrics. So mean time to detect, mean time to respond. If we're talking operational risk, mean time to recover. Boards are fixated on costs. So what about looking at mean number of incidents per week and average costs to resolve each incident? So I can't go through all of the different metrics. I think that the key is organizations need to look at this whole scope. If you are the CISO, who is your audience? Are you presenting to the whole board? You can't present all of these metrics. Which ones are going to resonate the most? If you're having a one-to-one with the chief operating officer, maybe you talk about mean time to recover. If you're talking with chief risk officer, so different discussions for different personas. Maybe last closing comment, as we said, lots of metrics, and you don't want to bombard the board with a lot of technical numbers. One more approach that organizations should consider is industry benchmarking. How are the other organizations within my industry doing, and where do we sit in relation to them? So that enables you to take all those 10 or 20 metrics you've looked at, boil it down to where do we sit in relation to the market. Makes it a lot more digestible for the board.
It's also something that a board of directors is used to doing, looking at the competitors and placing themselves and benchmarking in lots of other areas as well. So that's a natural way for the board to be going.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mark. I think you've given us a lot of insights. It's been very useful, very interesting.
Thank you, Joe, and I hope we provided some good insights for the audience.
I think we have. At least I certainly hope so. Well, that's it for today's Brass Tacks with Mark Child of IDC. I hope you found it interesting and useful, like Mark and I were just saying. Please join us again for another episode of Brass Tacks, Talking Cybersecurity, brought to you by Fortinet. This series is available both as an audio and a video podcast. You will find it on your regular podcast app or YouTube, as well as on Fortinet TV.